Hello and welcome to the first in this series of talks on Christianity and the environmental crisis. I'm John Daniels. I was delighted when the Dean of Hereford, the very Reverend Michael Taverner, asked me to work with him to arrange a series of Lent talks on this subject. In the event, due to the COVID-19 restrictions, only the first two ever got done. So it's good to have this opportunity to fill all 5 of them online now, which means that they'll be available to a wider audience. And this first talk is on Christian lifestyle. So a warm welcome to Dr. Isabel Carter, who's with us for this. Isabel trained in environmental sciences, and she worked with the charity Tear Fund for many years, leading their international publications team. Since going freelance some years ago, she's focused on climate change issues, coordinating Pray and Fast for the Climate, helping to set up the Marches Christian Environment Network, and leading the Eco-Church group at her local church, St. Lawrence's Church Stretton in Shropshire. She's a keen naturalist and walker who loves all kinds of wildlife, birds, butterflies, and trees in particular, so she tells me. So you're very welcome, Isabel. And without further ado, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I first gave this talk on March the 3rd this year, which now seems like another lifetime away. And I remember going to Hereford on the train and you could hardly see a hedge or a tree. There was just, just water all over the place. So it seems, from that point of view and all that's happened since, it does seem, yes, a very long time since I gave this talk. So I will modify what I say because of that. So my focus that I was given was to talk about our personal lifestyles, but I wanted, because I was the first in the series, to talk a bit more about climate change in general. Now, I recently celebrated a significant birthday, and as happens when you do that, I sort of found myself just thinking back, and in particular thinking back to my childhood and how life just seemed so much more straightforward and predictable. The sun seemed to shine through the summer holidays. The climate didn't flip from snow and extreme wind. We would put our summer clothes on in May, and that was that. And there wasn't nearly so much choice, but there seemed a lot of fun. There weren't very many choices on the television, for sure, one channel, then two. And I think nowadays one of the problems we have in life is just the choices that we have. We have so many. Our son was born in Kenya, and I remember bringing him back to the UK when he was 5 months old to introduce him. Now in Kenya, if you wanted to buy baby food, there was either baby rice or there wasn't. So that was your choice. And so he ate a lot of bananas. Anyway, when we came back and were picked up, my dad stopped outside a big chemist for me to buy some baby food. And I just couldn't cope. There were just shells. I think there must have been 25, 30 different varieties of baby food, of every description and flavour, and I just left. I couldn't cope. And I'm kind of reminded of that in a way. Everything is so difficult. If you care about what you buy, like tomatoes, you're confronted by tomatoes in a supermarket. So do you buy local in plastic? Do you buy cardboard packaging? Do you look for fair trade? Do you look at the country of origin and wonder about that? Or do you just not buy them because they're out of seasons? We have so much choice. And part of that choice means that we live way beyond our means in terms of global capacity, really. And there's this wonderful quote from Pope Francis about just how many worlds we need. We only have the one world. But the Pope Francis talked about World Overshoot Day. And last year, 2019, we reached World Overshoot Day, July the 29th, which meant we'd actually used up all that the Earth could regenerate by that date. And from then on, we were using more resources than the planet could regenerate. No, really serious. We only have the one world, and we're using up way more than the capacity of that world. At the moment, we're using 1.75 planets to meet our demand. There's a lot of research done by the Global Footprint Network if you wanted to follow that up. And of course, every year, that at the moment, that's going up. We're using more and more. And part of that is obviously the human population, which has more than doubled in the last since 1970. And that pressure, the pressure that's putting, that we as a human species are putting on other species, means that over 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction. We're living way beyond our means. And interestingly, going back to my first reflection, thinking back to my childhood, well, the time when our world was last living within its means was the 1960s, the late 1960s. My childhood times, so my memories of life being less complicated, well, it was, and we were living within our means. My background is Welsh. I come from South Wales, and the coal miners of South Wales would take canaries down into the coal mines with them. Because if ever the gases, the dangerous gases in the coal mines began to build up, particularly carbon monoxide, well, the canaries in their little cages would die. So the canaries were a real warning sign that, hey, it's time to get out of the mine or we're not going to survive. And I just think that analogy applies to so much of the warning signs we're getting with climate change. Temperature rises around the world. At the moment, we're on target for a temperature rise of 3 degrees, even if all countries meet their Paris commitments. The news yesterday, Sir John Houghton, a wonderful, wonderful man, died. I mean, he was somebody who influenced many with his warnings on climate change, and I was one of them. I mean, he totally changed my thinking. And one thing he said I always remember is the difference in temperature, degrees centigrade, between an interglacial period, which is where we are now, and a period of glaciation, when life would struggle, is 4 to 5 degrees. And that just shocked me. We know now we're over 1 degree centigrade. We're on course for 3 degrees the end of this century. Yeah, the dead canaries, yes. And alongside that temperature rise, we've seen melting glaciers, ice caps, carbon dioxide arising all around the world as we emit more fossil fuels. That means oceans are soaking up more carbon dioxide. Oceans are also warming. And the signs of that are more and more climate disasters, rising sea levels. Thawing permafrost, we don't think about that much in our country because we don't really have any in the UK. But I was really quite struck by a recent report on permafrost because so much, of the tundra is made up of ice. Tundra is 90% of ice, but it gives a structure and it's got a wonderful varied flora and fauna, and it just holds together. But when that permafrost melts, it just slumps. So you've got this picture, just this, horrendous muddy slump, which sometimes washes into the sea as well. And everything has gone, everything is lost with it. And huge amounts of methane gas are emitted too. So yeah, so many dead canaries, so many warning signs. And these headlines, you look at them now, they're a different era in a way, but these are only a month back. We've just had one of the warmest winters on record in Russia and Europe, bare ski slopes for many places. In the UK, we had Storm Ciara, and then a week later, Storm Dennis. Do you remember the pictures of the horrendous bushfires in Australia after their heat wave and drought? And although we hear less of it in our country, catastrophic flooding in several southern African countries. So, we're just seeing the warning signs all over. The day I came to Hereford to do my talk, the Met Office had just released a new chart for the rainfall in February. and the rainfall quantity in February was so extreme, they had to make 2 new bands of measurement. So the purple that you can see on this was brand new that day, had just been released to document the vast amount of rainfall that had just fallen in the last few weeks. So, you know, the warning signs are everywhere. The dead canaries are there, and we need to take heed.
Thank you, Isabel. You mentioned Earth Overshoot Day there a moment ago and the way it's getting earlier each year. Could you say something about what exactly Earth Overshoot Day is and how it's worked out?
Yes, I mean, several organisations have looked at this, but I think the Global Footprint Network is the main one now. And what they do is look at the capacity of our planet to generate the resources that we depend on. So things like food, timber, fresh water, the minerals, the general resources that we need to keep ourselves going. And that's divided by humanity's demand for that year. So that's obviously multiplied by the population.
Right.
So it's a very simple sum. The resources the Earth produces and can replenish, and the resources that we actually use.
Yeah. It's a really useful measure, isn't it, of being able to get a sense of what our demands on the Earth are and what the Earth is able to sustain. It's a very helpful kind of intuitive measure there. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it is, I think, and it's also just so many warning signs brought together. Yeah,
Sure.
so it is a very interesting one. Yeah.
Sure. Sorry, do continue.
Okay, so just moving now to look a little bit at the sort of ethics and the justice that lies behind what's going on. The fossil fuel industry, I mean, it's having a bit of a setback at the moment, but it is just still massive, despite the efforts of many denominations, organisations, churches to disinvest. But the fossil fuel industry is still putting massive resources in future exploration, although we're told that for all our sakes, we need to keep fossil fuels in the soil for us to have any hope of reducing our carbon emissions. And the response of so many people about climate change is either to shrug, just say, well, what can I do? People ignore it, they bury their heads like the ostrich did, and just pretend that, well, if we do nothing, surely it'll all go away. And I think COVID-19 is just a horrifying example, really, that when we know issues are likely to develop, shrugging doesn't mean they go away. There was apparently an exercise to test for how the UK could respond to a pandemic about 4 years ago. And it was really not good, but the results were so scary. I think the government shrugged and said, well, let's hope we won't have that problem. Yeah. The trouble with climate change is that the folk who suffer the most are the poorest. There's this quote from Malawi, from a Tear Fund partner, just saying rainfall is becoming more erratic and becoming less each year. Streams and rivers are drying up. Many rural areas don't have adequate water, or like this lady, have water that's really polluted. And a quote from a farmer in Mali: the rainy season has become unpredictable. Water levels fall year by year. Some kinds of animals and vegetation have disappeared. The future is bleak for farmers. Everything has become more complex. You know, farmers in poorer countries, they don't have huge supplies of seed. You know, it's such a difficult decision. When do you plant? Have the rain started? Do you plant now? And then, of course, if the rains fail, your seeds shrivel and you've got nothing more to plant for the next time round. So, you know, farming is just so much more difficult. There are so many things that could drive us, but I just think one of the simplest things that as Christians is that Jesus just gave us 2 commandments: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul and mind, to love our neighbours as ourselves. And we see those in 3 of the Gospels. And I just think those are such clear guidance for us. How can we love God with all our heart, soul and mind if we're ignoring this amazing creation that he's given us, that we know he delights in. How can we say that we love our neighbours as ourselves if we carry on living lifestyles that we know are really hurting poorer people around the world? So simple, but very, very powerful, I think, and a real helpful driver in the changes we know we need to make. A few, encouraging things, commitments that are being made. The Paris Agreement back in 2015 is probably the biggest, the most far-reaching, really, in that it was a global agreement where all the countries present signed up to commit to trying to keep global average temperatures to less than 2 degrees. Now, countries are staying with their commitments, with one notable exception, and countries are responding and they're planning, but the signs are still really worrying. The UK government at present is committed to achieving net carbon zero by 2050, and they're working pretty hard on that. We've got committee set up to help us do that. Now, the Church of England made a really, really radical decision back in February in the General Synod, where they committed the Church of England to achieving carbon zero by 2030, which is seriously massive. And we've also got Extinction Rebellion, who want carbon zero by 2025. But I think for us, that commitment by the Church of England, that's something very, very significant. And it's something that the Church of England can't just expect small parish churches up and down the country to do on their own. There needs to be a lot of help. They've recently appointed a National Environment Officer, Joe Chamberlain. They've got a sustainability officer, but I'm imagining they're going to have a whole load more resources. They support diocesan environmental officers at the moment. But individual churches, to achieve this target of carbon zero is, we're going to need.
It is very ambitious, isn't it, Isabel? I'm sure people will have been struck by that. Now, I just wonder if you're able to offer one or two words of advice to a typical local church. What could they do collectively to work towards this target?
Yeah, I mean, it helps if you've got one or two folk in a church who really care about this. One or two enthusiasts. I mean, I think the biggest thing is to sign up to become an eco-church. It's something that Arosha have set up. And it's such a helpful thing that they help church to look at what they're doing in 5 different areas. There's loads of resources, there's loads of ideas. Sometimes it's really encouraging and churches think, oh, actually we're doing really quite well in that aspect. And then there are other things and churches think, crumbs, we haven't even thought about that one. But it is a really clear, helpful thing to do. And I think the other thing is not to look on it as a negative, because there's lots in it that can really bring people together. Lots of things that churches can do together to encourage each other, sharing stuff, litter picks. Our church had a little target where we gave out seed potatoes, and we got all the children and any adults to grow a potato. And then we measured to see who had the most, and we had a shared lunch where we ate these baked potatoes. For some children, they'd never planted anything, so to grow a potato was good. Getting children involved in nature, that's a really good thing. And I think a very clever thing is for churches to keep praying, because you can bring in so many issues if you pray about these issues every month. But yes, I think the major thing is eco-church, which just binds all these things together.
Thank you.
So the last bit of the talk is looking at lifestyles, and I'm very proud of this carbon credit card. I bought a copy of it with me to the talk. And this was given to me by the Marches Energy Agency back in, you can see, 2007. So it's a bit old now, but nevertheless the message is still pretty powerful. And so this was the front of it, and then on the back it gave these details. And it was said at the time that every UK citizen was accountable for 9.3 tons of carbon emissions. But we were supposed to get to less than 2. So there you go, it's my credit card on the front. giving me 2 tons of carbon. And that's pretty much the same, really. We all need to get to less than 2 tons of carbon. The average for a citizen was 9.3 tons then. It's actually gone down now. The average UK citizen at the moment is accountable for 8.3. And that's kind of been done for us, if you like, because our electricity uses a lot more renewables. Travel has become a lot more efficient. Our cars use far less fuel and things like that. So without us making any effort, that our emissions have actually gone down. But it's still quite sobering to look at this and work it out and to do your carbon footprint. I mean, one of the things that's quite funny on this is the heating target you can see. They've just got insulate, because that is so key. It's not about just making the heating efficient. If you insulate, you don't need so much of it. So anyway, that was a useful thing. And that card, it certainly prompted me to go away and work out my personal carbon footprint. Because only when you've done that can you really see the key areas, the challenging areas where you need to really focus on things. So, and in fact, we were so challenged by that as a couple, we actually moved to buy a house that it was a lot easier to make low carbon. And we did buy a house where we could take out all the fossil fuel central heating and to put lots of insulation in. So it was, yeah, that card made quite a difference to me. I mean, there's lots of things about the way we buy, the way we eat, you know, to buy food that's local, that's seasonal. Isn't it interesting when you go shopping now that there's so many shortages of things, which of course are coming from around the world. So it's a good reminder really of what's locally available that, you know, should always remind us really to think about what's in season. Whenever we can, to buy organic and fair trade. If you can, grow our own. Obviously that's ideal if you've got a garden or an allotment. Plastic, thanks to David Attenborough and lots of agencies, I think we're all aware of the dangers of plastic and how we can try and use less of it. The need to reuse stuff instead of always running out and buying something new. Something people may not have thought about, which is really good if you're in a church with home groups, say, is the idea of sharing stuff. You know, I mean, how many hedge trimmers does a church need? I mean, you know, how often do people cut their hedges? Once, twice, 3 times a year? You know, lots of big items, tools, tents, for example, lots of things we could share rather than everybody feeling they have to run out and buy their own. Travel. When I re-looked at this, I kind of laughed really, because of course at the moment we're nearly all of us confined to lockdown and our travelling plans have been put to one side. But nevertheless, you know, there is a real value in enjoying holidays in this country that are closer to home, that don't have to involve driving or let alone flying. The cars we drive, yeah, those are big, expensive decisions. I mean, for us personally, that's the biggest one, I guess, for us, because in a way we'd love to get rid of a car, but because of family situations, we haven't made that step yet. But car sharing, you know, is another way around that. And the relocation, yeah, for some people, I think particularly when you're out, you know, remote rural areas where you have to get in a car to do anything, to go shopping, to do anything. Yeah, there's a lot of mileage in living in small communities. So lots of things we can do personally. And then I think in our churches, you know, our churches should be leading the way in our communities. And I often feel we're a long way behind really, which is why I'm personally so excited about that 2030 deadline. But there does need to be a sense of urgency, a real desire for Christians to be seen to be leading the way and taking initiatives. A personal carbon footprint I've mentioned, but you can do a carbon footprint for your church, and the Church of England are just in the process of releasing a really helpful way of measuring that. There's a massive movement. Operation Noah was one of the key agencies to disinvest from fossil fuels. Has your church talked about that at PCC? Can you disinvest? your investments, or can you make sure that the energy sources you use are just recyclable, are using using renewable energy. And we can also support our youngsters. One of the really encouraging things is the school climate strikes. If you've got youngsters in your church linked with that, well, support them, pray for them, do things as a church that, show that we care for the environment, but that can be fun, bringing people together and witnessing to the community, whether that's creating gardens, community gardens, or litter picking, anything like that is, just being good news in our communities. Yes, this is a question that I'm sure lots of people get asked. Is it all too little, too late? I don't know personally, but I feel it's never too late to respond. And I think if this COVID-19 emergency has shown nothing else, it's just how very resourceful we can be as a species. So there's always things that can be done. But the predictions, they're not good. We're very aware of the risk of extinction to so many species. But there are lots of things happening. The school strikes have been a hugely encouragement movement. A lot of the Extinction Rebellion, there are leaders, really good leaders who are speaking out. And the UN climate summits, have become a real gathering together and a real desire for change to happen. Can we imagine another way of living? Well, yes, because of, who would have believed that in 1 month our life could have changed so much? There are other ways of doing things. And this crisis that we're living through now, this pandemic, none of us could have predicted how massive these changes would be. And we can't go back to life as it was. We can imagine other ways of living. We can do things differently. And when I'm feeling really depressed about how things are going, there's that verses in Psalm 104, I think it's verse 30, where God talks about his creation and how he will renew the face of the earth. I don't know what he means by that, but I do take encouragement that however bleak things look at times, renewal can come and differences can be made.
That's, just incredible, isn't it, to reflect on that, the changes that have happened in this last month without anybody having anticipated them or kind of orchestrated them. And it is, in a perverse way, encouraging, isn't it? Because it shows us that radical change is possible, and without having to have planned it enormously beforehand. Where cometh the hour, cometh the species, you could almost argue. Can I just ask one question about some of that? And again, it's about sort of the way in which individuals can make a difference here, Isabel. Because I just wonder which, if any, of the new imposed habits that the pandemic has imposed upon us, which of those habits you think we might most usefully retain when hopefully the virus has been and gone?
Yes, I've been thinking about this a lot, really, what we can learn, what we can take forward. I think there's probably 3 areas. I think the first is people. We have really realised how important people are. This real love of family, friends, communities, all the people we can no longer visit and hug and greet, but that we're really focused on communicating with, keeping in touch with. I hope when we get out of this, all the cafes and pubs and restaurants will see a real surge in just people enjoying coming together and being together. And I think the other thing about people is just valuing people, and particularly the people that I think we may have taken for granted. The people who hold our society together, the NHS, care homes, cleaners, rubbish people, food processors, just to value these people. Certainly not to kick them out. So I think people is the first thing. I think the second would be place. We're quite lucky in that we have got countryside near us. but suddenly we can't go anywhere. So we have to make the most of where we are. And, we've found new routes that we'd never explored before. And we just value, I think, just the little things. I've got a nature diary for the garden. I can't do all the things I usually do, going out bird surveying and things. So just really looking and enjoying the insect species, the birds in the garden, stuff like that. I just hope when this is over, that valuing of the nearness and the place will not immediately change to everyone leaping on airlines again. I made a pledge not to fly for personal reasons 12 years ago, and I've not broken that and have no plans to. It would be great if many more people decided, well, we don't really need to fly. We've got lots of lovely things nearby. My son does training in IT, and he's found his work really stressful in that he has to rush about the country, from north to south, and then deliver training. Well, now he's doing it online. And he just says, I'm just going to refuse to going back to rushing about. What I'm doing online is just as effective. I've got so much more quality of life, and time for other bits of my work. So I hope all the people who've learned to work together virtually are not going to put that aside. So I think, place, limiting where we go to is key. And then I think the last thing, for people, place, priorities. Unfortunately, coming out of this massive pandemic, this crisis, does not mean that the climate crisis has gone away. I think one of the most interesting priorities will be that people actually understand now what it means to flatten the curve when it comes to the transmission of the virus. But we have yet to flatten the curve of carbon emissions. We have yet to flatten the curve of the rising global temperatures. And they are no less more dangerous than flattening that curve for infection. So that's a really good phrase. I think we have got to flatten the curve, because the climate crisis will actually have far bigger implications than this pandemic to us as a human species. And I think we've seen, massive change. Who could have dreamed of what's happened? How we have changed as human societies. And there's lovely stories, there's awful stories, so much tragedy, but there are so many lovely stories of innovation, of caring, and just the valuing of the local rather than the global. So I think, my longing really is that government, I know they're frantically busy trying to cope, but that they would see this as an opportunity, not to rush back to life as it was, but to all the good that has come out of this that could be taken forward.
Yeah. Isabel, that's been fascinating. We've covered a huge range of topics there, just very briefly, in barely half an hour or so. And thank you for that summary at the end there, which gives us something to take away with us, which relates to the extraordinary circumstances in which we find ourselves today. So thank you all for watching as well. Tune in again for the second talk in this series on Christianity and the environmental crisis, which is going to be on the agricultural world. Thank you, and see you then.
Thank you.